you drew out in your article two kinds of social capital, or two ways in which social capital can be afforded. One through prestige, and that's the reward of doing the difficult things, for being competent, and it's what you refer to as producing positive externalities. And then you've got that is afforded by status, which is you uphold the norms of the group. And I think we'll come on to that shortly, because I'd like to talk about the rise of activist networks. But the prestige angle, social capital being afforded for prestige, I think you could argue, and it links back to that final point you made about the US FAA, that we have created a world post-industrial revolution where we no longer reward people for competence, for doing the risky, clever, hard, entertaining things, to quote your article. And Elon Musk has made this point, which is people need to build things. And people who've defended him have said, look, if you don't want him dominating, well, then go and build some stuff, because that's what he's doing. The reason why he's so successful is because he's had all of these ideas and he's taken the risks. He's come up with some clever ideas. It's hard, but he's seen it through, and that's the way he's built. But the rest of us, we're just thinking about regulating. We're just thinking about more bureaucracy. And because we have set up a whole bunch of various institutions which are geared towards more bureaucracy around the things that they care about, that's a way that you can expand your own influence and social capital without actually doing the hard things. But everyone in the group's pointing to each other saying, well done, you're doing a great job. This is exactly what we need. And you can see that in the European Union. Whilst you got the US and China fighting it out to develop AI, EU is not doing that. They're just regulating it. And they take pictures of their bureaucrats looking really happy that, look, we've just created this new 8,000-page regulation as to what you can and can't do, and everyone flanking them is developing it themselves. So let's talk a little bit about how our economic system, our cultural life has come to be dominated by activists. You wrote an article about activist network states. Yep. What are they, and why are we living in one?
Oh, well, excellent. Yes. Okay. So a seminal cultural moment of recent times is now over 10 years ago, just over 10 years ago now, November 2014, a rocket scientist is the lead person in a very, 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 very clever thing, which is they land a probe on a comet, which is really, really hard, and we had never done it before. So this is the classic clever thing that the scientific revolution and the industrial revolution was built on. You've done this really clever thing. You get prestige for doing this really clever thing. What happens? He happened to be wearing a Hawaiian shirt with semi-naked women on it, which turns out was actually a gift from a female friend. He got publicly monstered and humiliated for his shirt. Now, that's the difference between prestige, the clever thing of landing on a comet, which is really hard, and we don't like your shirt because it's got semi-naked women on it, so we are going to massively stigmatize you. And stigma is the negative aspect of propriety, right? And so that's the other, well, there's actually three status systems. The two we're talking about here are prestige and propriety. And stigma is the negative thing. Now, all societies have stigma because they want to stop you doing stuff that hurts other people, right? It's all the negative externalities. But like everything human, it can be misused. And what you're seeing is that use of stigmatization to punish people on, an ever-widening bunch of new sins. Misgendering, that's a new sin. Nobody knew what misgendering was in 2014, or if they did, they're a tiny minority somewhere, right? Incredible sensitivity about language, new sins. And stigmatization is being used to punish people for transitioning against these new sins, right? So, and you've got to say people of color, you can't say colored people, for example. Now, that's a status game. That's a status leverage game. It is power through controlling what is legitimate discourse, through controlling the legitimacy of discourse. Okay. And if you can, and it's power also through narrative control. Like you control the narrative. And if you want to see that playing out, Elon Musk saying, all these girls got raped, perhaps you should worry about that, on one hand, and all the people complaining that Elon Musk is complaining, right? So there's the people who say, actually industrial level rape over decades is a horrifying crime. How did this happen? Why aren't you talking about it? And on the other hand, you say the people who really, really resent Elon Musk are bringing it up because they want to get narrative control, or they want to get narrative control back. And it turns out if you're Elon Musk and you've bought Twitter and turned it to X, you can insert, because you've got 200 million followers, you can insert yourself into the news cycle and you can get the news cycle. Right. Okay. So that is stigmatization used successfully in the case of Shirtgate, and as so far unsuccessfully against Elon Musk as a form of activism and of status control and status leverage and narrative control. Okay. So activism is an attempt to change society in some way. And a classic way of doing activism is to stigmatize previously acceptable behavior. And sometimes, frankly, that's fair enough, right? When we got men and women working together in offices and professional establishments way more than they used to, actually, we did need to stigmatize men who thought they could pinch bottoms, right? We did need to stigmatize men who thought they could leer at their female workplaces. We did have to say, no, actually, you do have to keep your dick in your pants, right? That sort of stigmatization was absolutely fair enough. It had to be something to happen, and some of it took court cases and people went to jail, right? That's a stigmatization. We've moved to this new situation. We've got men and women working together at a level we haven't had before, and men have to just stop doing certain things, right? So that's reasonable stigmatization. Now, a lot of what's happened since is they've taken this weapon that has some value and has existed and evolved because it has value, and then turned it into a weapon of social leverage and social activism. And because we're very prosperous societies, we've developed a whole set of stuff that's based on that sort of activism. One is all the non-profits, right? All the advocacy groups. And part of what happened there is, civil rights got achieved for African Americans in the United States. Civil rights got achieved for women and equality before law. Civil rights got achieved for gay and lesbian people and equality before law, and they can get married, they can adopt, right? Okay. But these organizations have millions and millions and millions of dollars flowing through them and suddenly nothing to do. Right? What do? Well, they pivot to something else. And what they pivoted to was trans. And what the gay and lesbian organizations pivoted to was trans. And part of the problem there is there were two huge problems. Everyone thought, well, this is just like the gay issue, when it's really, really, really not. And they use the gay model when it's a really, really different case. And so you've got this massive advocacy economy, which needs to keep the donations flowing, has all this structure, and is based on activism. And the natural lever they use is stigmatization. And of course, social media makes this potentially much more effective. Right? So you got a situation recently where I think it's the CEO of the Therapeutic Association in the UK had to publicly abase himself because it was found that he was following Tommy Robinson on Twitter or on X, right? That's a utterly spurious sin used in stigmatization. So you have this network where stigmatization is an easy mechanism, and social media really makes you able to scale up that mechanism. And one of the problems with social media is you're only dealing with slivers of people, right? If you're actually physically with somebody, you see the full person. This is a full person. You get the whole interactions. And it's also something we've evolved for to deal with for, hundreds of thousands of years. Right. Online, you're just dealing with a sliver of a person. It's not the same feedback at all. So a lot of the ameliorating factors and pacifying, humanizing factors go away. And it, upgrades, scales up stigmatism. And that's an easy mechanism for activists. But there's also other things going wrong too. What we've done is we've moved from a situation where bureaucrats just made things work to where they have these moral projects. You don't give bureaucrats moral projects for several reasons, one of which it gives them airs and pretensions way beyond their capacities. It inflates their authority and it undermines accountability. Because if they say, we're doing X to do this good thing, and you say, well, I think you shouldn't be doing X, their response is, you don't want us to do this good thing. What I call the actor's fallacy. So it undermines accountability, it inflates their authority, and it also, how do you measure this moral project? When do you know it's worked? And again, you can't tell it's worked because there is no good measure. Okay. And so people like Christopher Caldwell and Richard Hanier, who point out that anti-discrimination and civil rights legislation has proved to be a real problem because it's created this whole legal bureaucratic structure, which is based on the presumption that if you don't have this legal bureaucratic structure, everybody's hovering on the end of wrong action and wrong think. And you've undermined freedom of association. You've engaged in all this forced association. And if you look back at human societies, who you choose or choose not to associate is actually an important mechanism. And of course, people can exclude people quite illegitimately. That's absolutely true, particularly in small communities. But systematic forced association is turning out to be a problem too, because people can't step back from what they regard as bad behaviour. And you've created this, embedded network of people on the presumption that if they weren't there, everyone would become, raging homophobes and raging racists and raging whatevers. Right. Now, that's just rubbish. Right. The crucial thing was, in fact, the change in the stigmatization. Once you stop stigmatizing people because they were black or stigmatizing people who were gay, you eliminated that stigmatization. That did the overwhelming majority of the work. And this complicated, expensive structure is actually doing way more harm than good because it's interfering in ways. It leads directly to all the DEI nonsense, for example. So it gets in the way of people just functioning and getting along. And so you're creating these activist structures. And the incentive is constantly to target the bureaucracies, because then you don't have to go through the boring stuff of convincing voters and arguing your case and so forth. You go via the bureaucracy. It's what the writer Wesley Yang calls the non-electoral politics of institutional control. That's not quite the right phrase, but there's a phrase like that. And that's a problem. And one of the things you get, for example, is the UN, which is completely unaccountable. Like, you get people laundering ideas for the UN, which are typical terrible ideas. They go to the UN, they get written up by the UN, and then everyone says, well, we should do this because the international communities agree, right? You're doing end run around democratic accountability. That's one of the big problems of the EU. The EU is a little bit more accountable than the UN. Well, quite a lot more accountable because the UN is completely unaccountable. But it's still, the accountability is still not very good. So you're getting the EU being used to launder these ideas and do end runs around democratic accountability, which goes back to your 5,000 word regulatory document, which has not been subject to anywhere near the examination that they should be subject to. And these regulatory claims are based on claims of we know that, which are almost invariably spurious. They don't know, right? But their status comes from being the superior deciders. And if you give them a moral project, that makes that much worse. the European project inflates the authority quite illegitimately of what the EU gets up to. So you've got these networks of, and academe, of course, generates all these ideas from people who also don't have to make things work. There's a constant problem with the ideas coming out of academe because it's been done by people who don't have to make things work, but can get this spurious prestige from this golden idea. And that's been just a perennial problem. It's been a problem for decades amongst education faculty, for example. Teachers have become full of really dumb ideas which don't work, which were not reality tested, but which inflated the egos of the academics, either on the basis of I've got this brilliant idea that no one else has thought of before, that's because it doesn't work, or we're going to change society in this dramatic and wonderful way, which sanctifies activism. So you've got this sanctification of activism, this generation of ideas, of morally inflating ideas. You've got these moral inflating of the authority of bureaucrats way beyond their levels of knowledge and competence. You've got this undermining and these end runs around democratic accountability. So we end up with a situation in Britain, for example, where Britain has a really stupid and disastrous migration policy that the electorate has never approved of, never agreed to, and the end runs around democratic accountability have just been endless. The British elite political class has just systematically lied. Because they just know, and it turns out they just didn't, that in fact the electorate was correct and the elite was wrong. Democratic accountability isn't perfect, but it turns out it's a lot better than the lack of it.